Welcome. Right, we've got a few people still being admitted to the session, but I'm going to make a start because we've got so many things to discuss. Uh, just, I think just to let you know as well, this meeting is being recorded, so just to let you know that, and you'll be able to access it after the session as well. Right. I'm going to make a start. I can see there's lots of people interested in rabies today. This is terrifying, perhaps more terrifying than rabies even. Right. Uh, I'm hoping you can see my screen. I've not got the usual little box around my screen, which is disorienting me a little bit. Debbie, again, can you give me a nod if you can see a slide that says not so cute and fluffy now? Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. Oh, Zoom looks a bit different than normal. Zoom likes to floor us at times, doesn't it? So, welcome to this short webinar about rabies and its many facets. Nature is both scary and beautiful. Thank you for giving up your lunch as well to do this. And if you're eating your lunch right now, I hope it's something nice. I'm a big fan of eating your way through a Zoom session. I'm Alice. I'm a specialist travel health nurse and I regularly teach in the field of travel health. Some of you might have met me at work or maybe on a course before. So hello again, if that's the case. Or maybe you've done a Health Academy course already or read some of the blogs or used some of the fabulous free resources on the site as well. If you've not, do have a browse after the course as well. I'll link you to some of that later. So I'm mainly speaking to you today from the perspective of a post-exposure rabies patient, and I really urge you to have a read of my blog when you get a chance, which I'll link you to at the end, which explains all the stupid things I've done abroad on holiday. Well, not all of them, but quite a few of them, and my encounters with a rabid dog myself. So I'm very, very passionate about talking about this particular subject. So there'll be at least one person out there with a dog or a cat sat on their lap. So maybe cover their ears for this talk. We don't want them getting any ideas. There'll also very likely be someone who books in for a post-exposure rabies consultation after this as well, as there usually is on courses when we start teaching about rabies. Hotel kittens and puppies are a very common source of post-exposure rabies tales in the travel clinics. So there's a lot of you here today, I imagine from various different places, and it's so lovely that so many of you are here and interested in this topic. As I said, the webinar will be recorded and it'll be on the site sometime after this. So hello, if you are watching this from the future as well, just the usual caveats that things change over time. So if you're watching it in a year's time, it might be slightly different by then. Maybe we'll have eradicated rabies, who knows? It'd be nice, wouldn't it? I've also been collecting some survey responses just at the beginning of the session, which I might have to vet a little bit for confidentiality. So I may add a little bit more onto the recorded version, depending on how far we get today. But benefit of being live is you can ask questions as you go along and not leave with any misunderstandings and things. Just a quick plea. I know there's going to be loads of people in this group who are really experienced with rabies and will probably know the answers to a lot of questions that people ask who are less experienced. So if you could put any questions in the chat box as we go along, and if anybody who's quite experienced in the group wants to help with answering those questions, I would be most grateful because it's very hard to keep track of a chat box when there's this many people on the course. So if you can help me out, I'd be very, very grateful. So one of my biggest passions is making sure people don't forget to talk about rabies in whatever field they're in, really, and to make sure that if they do talk about it, they talk about it properly and they do it well. So this is a disease with pretty much 100% death rate, yet nearly 100% success rate involving the vaccines. So you don't get statistics much like this in the world of vaccination. So why else is this an important topic? So there's always loads of reports of rabies from so many regions of the world. Somebody perhaps just needs to unmute there. Got a little bit of feedback. For example, in Vietnam, just in January and February this year, rabies killed 22 people. Most of those were children. Last year, in the same time period, there was 10 cases recorded a year ago. And so there's been quite big lapses in animal vaccination around the world and human vaccination as well, likely impacted by the pandemic, which to be fair. It's affected everything, hasn't it, the pandemic? So it's really essential that we always warn our patients of the rabies risk when they have contact with warm-blooded animals during their travel, and let them know what to do urgently when exposed. Our advice needs to be excellent. And that's presumably why you've all turned up today, to protect your travellers as much as possible. Or maybe you've booked a holiday this summer and you just want to know a bit more about rabies. So whatever reason you're here, I'm really glad you are. And Lou, oh, don't worry about the movement on your screen. Oh, it's tough. You've got a baby with you as well. Oh, hard dual tasking, isn't it? So let's start with a quick question. So where do we look for rabies risk? So let's say you've got a traveller in front of you and you want to find out if the country they're going to is rabies endemic. What do you do? Where do you look for this information? What will tell you that? Oh, I think the chat box is going to be flooded with the same response here. But yes, quite a few of you wrote, yeah, NASNAC. One a Travax user there as well. Yeah. Absolutely. Excellent. Yes. So we start by looking at the country of, that somebody's going to. A lot of you based in England will probably be using NASNAC. If you're up in Scotland, you might be using Travax, or you might use a bit of both, whatever you are. But yes, we go to a database. And usually when you get there, it lists the rabies, usually under some travellers, and it will say something like rabies is present in terrestrial or domestic animals in this country, or it might say there's no risk in domestic animals, but there is in bats. And in fact, most of the world pretty much is going to mention bats. So rabies is pretty much always there hanging around on NAFNAC or Travax or whatever you're using. When you want to establish if somebody's going to an endemic country. But there's still quite a lot of people about who are fairly unconfident with dealing with talking about rabies. And that's why we are doing this session, really, because it's quite common. I'm just going to put some of the survey I put on at the beginning. This is some of the results so far. It looks like quite a lot of you are fairly confident. Didn't give you long to answer them survey questions, I'm afraid, at the beginning. But there are still some people who are not very confident. Quite a lot of you have dealt with post-exposure rabies cases as well. And there's a fair few people on here who would be very confident dealing with a rabies case, but some not so much. Haven't got a huge amount of responses on that just yet. But then again, we didn't give you an awful lot of time. Oh, I've just got a message about someone being late to join. Don't worry, you're welcome here, and thank you for joining at all. That's really nice that you're here. So, what are we going to cover in this very short session? Hence why I've drank lots of coffee and I'm going to be trying to talk as fast as I can. We're going to look at what actually is rabies, have a rundown of that to remind us of what it actually is. We're going to look at the connection with Greek mythology there. Just wanted to add something a bit more interesting and different in. And then speaking of myths, which this is one of the diseases that has an awful lot of misconceptions associated with it. We're going to talk about how to talk about the vaccines and debunk some well-circulating fallacies. We're going to look at then whose job is it to sort all this out if you establish that somebody's been exposed to rabies abroad. And we're going to just have a quick visit of the post-exposure vaccines and the treatment when people do announce they've made friends with a cute kitten somewhere and spit them or something. And I really like to teach using examples and cautionary tales and case studies and things. I just think it sticks in your mind a bit better and it's more interesting to listen to as well. So I'm going to share a few cases and things with you as we go through, mainly towards the second half. So let's start with what is rabies itself. And Jackie, I can see you're asking about the booster. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but generally once you've had a full course of rabies, boosters are only recommended depending on really how risky you're at. But we'll talk about that a bit more, Jackie. I hope it'll become clear. So what is rabies and what does it do to the body? Well, rabies is caused by a virus, specifically by lysoviruses. And this is the name of the virus that causes the clinical manifestation of rabies. And here's a depiction of Lyssa, the Greek goddess of mad rage. She would induce a rage in animals, so they'd attack the enemies or those who scorned her, not to be messed with, this particular Greek goddess. The Roman equivalent was called rabies. So this is where the names have originated from. And interestingly, rabies is often associated with vampires and werewolves and things. Like you get bitten by something and then you transform and then you become very sensitive to certain things. Like with vampires, it's the sun and silver and crosses. With rabies, it's water, and you get that symptom of hydrophobia amongst many other symptoms. So this disease has been knocking around for 4,000 odd years, basically as long as people have been interacting with cats and dogs and domesticating them and stuff. It's the deadliest virus that we know, the deadliest one. It's a very, very good virus for avoiding our natural defenses, and it will pretty much always kill its host once it takes hold. It's actually one of the first diseases that humans developed vaccines for. And we have a bit of an anniversary this week. We should have done the webinar yesterday, because yesterday, on the 6th of June in 1885, is when Louis Pasteur first created the first ever rabies vaccines. So happy anniversary. It's 139 years old. And it's very, very successful, the rabies vaccines that we have. But despite the success and effectiveness of those vaccines, more on those later, not everyone has access to them or chooses to have them or realizes that they even exist at all. And because of this, 60,000 people a year die of rabies on average. Almost half of those are children. And completely needlessly, given that we do have effective vaccines for humans and animals as well. Just to put this even further into perspective, there's 9 children, it kills a child every 9 minutes. 100 children die every day of rabies. That's about 14 kids an hour over a 15-hour period. So it's really not to be sniffed at. Children often get bitten in the head and the face area, so the disease progression is a lot faster. And of course, children don't listen to anything we say about not touching animals either. So that's another thing. In Africa, there's something like 22,000 deaths there out of that 60,000 people who die every year. And in Asia, there's 35,000 deaths a year generally, mainly dog-mediated, and nobody has ever survived dog-mediated rabies that's been spread via a dog. India actually accounts for the most deaths in Asia and worldwide. And this is why sometimes when you have those VFR travelers and you ask them about, are there any family pets at home? They look at you and go, why would we have a dog? You know, it's because of course in these countries people are particularly afraid of dogs and cats and having animals as pets and things. So what does this virus do? So it enters through the human body via the saliva of an infected mammal. So that could be a bite or a scratch or a mucous membrane exposure. I know there's somebody on the poll who's put about somebody eating a watermelon that a dog had licked there. So it's the saliva that is the main mode of transmission. So what happens is the virus then goes into the muscle tissues and it replicates there for a bit, and then it finds its way to a nerve cell where it sneaks in at the terminal end of it before fulfilling its aim, which is to head to the brain. That is the goal of this virus. It wants to get to the brain, and it does so by hijacking the nerve mechanisms and kind of making its way up to the brain through the nerves. And it's very sinister, really, because during that process, the patient and their immune system is absolutely none the wiser during this process. It really attacks the body's defenses so that we don't even know it's there. And it's still a bit unknown how it actually kills, because normally with viruses, they replicate in the body quite a lot until they just damage everything. And that's usually what will kill somebody or really injure them. But this virus doesn't really appear to replicate much. So it doesn't really overwhelm the body. What this virus does is send instructions to the central nervous system to attack its defenses. So it does things like orders the T cells to commit suicide, or it hides within nerve cells, and it stops things like interferons. So one of the ways that viruses work and the immune system is, when the immune system thinks something might be going on, the cells can become more transparent, so you can the immune system can see through it and see if there's anything dodgy in there. If there is, the immune system will wipe it out. It'll get rid of the cell, which will get rid of the virus at the same time. However, rabies doesn't let the immune system see what's going on. Oh, I just need to mute. That's great. Um, so it largely goes undetected until it gets to the brain, and that's when you start getting the symptoms, and that's when pretty much it's curtains, really. You're a bit of a goner once it gets to the brain and you start having symptoms. The body then tries to produce an immune response, but it's often not fast enough before the virus has taken hold. So Lyssa is just free to jump from neuron to neuron, heading for the brain, largely undetected. Sometimes it takes a long time to get to the brain because nerve cells are very long. And if you're bitten on an ankle and you're 6 foot tall, it's going to take a while. But Lyssa is a patient monster. The average incubation, generally from when you're bitten to when it gets to the brain, is about 2 weeks to 3 months. That's the average, but it can be many years, depending on where you're bitten and the viral load at the time. There's somebody actually who's just put on the poll about it, a person they saw going to India who's an elderly gentleman who'd been bitten 40 years ago by a dog in India and was very surprised to know he had to have post-exposure treatment. So it can be many years, and we're really cautious with that. Once it gets to the brain, it kind of scrambles the brain, which is why you get strange symptoms like anxiety, confusion, paralysis, aggression, all kinds of symptoms. And we'll look more at symptoms when we look at the cases. It's a really horrible, painful way to die, and the patient's usually fully aware of it all the way to the end. And it pretty much is palliative care only. Horrible to watch. I did consider whether to show you some videos of final stage symptoms, but decided against it because it's Friday and it's very depressing to watch. But there are quite a few videos on YouTube. Like there's this gentleman who you can see is restrained on the bed there because there's often a lot of agitation. That's freely available on YouTube. There's a video of a child and expressing the hydrophobia, the mother trying to give him water, and you can watch that. There's loads of rabid animals on YouTube as well that you can have a look at. Oh, I'm muted. Oh, it says I'm not. Oh, somebody else can hear me. Oh, Bethan, I wonder if maybe you just need
Yeah,
to
we
turn.
can hear you
Oh, good. Phew.
all the way.
Maybe just turn your volume up, Megan, and see if that works. Oh, thank you for the flood of I can hear yous in the chat box there. Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, basically this is really horrible to watch. You can go on YouTube and have a look at those symptoms if you want to, but it is, have a glass of wine nearby and some tissues, and not nice. So after causing all that mess in the brain and all the instructions going wrong, you then pretty much die. But what happens is the virus is dead clever. It turns around and then it goes back into the salivary glands, ready to infect another host, which is really unusual for a virus. It kind of just changes course. It's a really fascinating virus and a real concern for our travellers who could be infected and not even know about it until it's too late. So in terms of the symptoms and the treatment, so this is one of the oldest and deadliest infections we have. Rabies is definitely long overdue for development of a successful treatment once symptoms present. And you may have heard of the Milwaukee Protocol. It's been called a few different things over the years, and it's had many evolutions there. But survival has been documented in a handful of cases. So, and that's after symptom onset, but only a handful, mind. In 2004, an unvaccinated girl survived the symptom onset part with a novel therapy, which we now dubbed the Milwaukee Protocol. She was the first ever unvaccinated person to survive. Prior to 2004, there'd only been 5 documented human survivors, all of whom had had some sort of pre-exposure vaccination beforehand, albeit late or incomplete. So when this first rabies survivor happened without having any vaccines beforehand, there was like this new hope everywhere for rabies victims across the world. But sadly, it's not had much success since, and it's failed more times than it's achieved, unfortunately. The protocol generally involves inducing a prolonged therapeutic coma and reducing cerebral vasospasm. Just because if you can minimize brain activity or minimizing the damage that might be happening to the brain. Usually then you're hit with some very strong antivirals, not specific to rabies, but ones that will make the body do its usual antivirus management. Generally, you won't vaccinate at this point because a vigorous immune response might exacerbate the disease process, but also interfere with the natural immunity that you're making while you've got the symptoms, because this is the first time the body's like going, oh, something wrong, I need to do something about this. The coma seems to be the best bet of all. And the 2004 case was really hopeful. She was actually in The Guardian last year talking about her experiences. She had a very long road to recovery. But if you wanted to read about her experience, there's a QR on the slide there. Basically, her case demonstrated that actually the symptoms could be reversible. I mean, she was in hospital for 11 weeks. She spent 2 years in an outpatient therapy unit. She had to spend 2 years learning to walk again. But she did reverse those symptoms, which is promising. But also the other thing that case demonstrated was that a natural immune response is possible to the virus. However, it's a very risky strategy to lean on if you're declining vaccines on the basis of, well, I'll just wait till I get symptoms and then I'll get it treated then, which is, as you know, something people often do. They go, oh, I'll wait till I get symptoms and then I'll sort myself out. We're talking less than 40 survivors on this protocol. Very little of those had any, not had any vaccines at all. So fortunately, there's a much better option than waiting for symptoms that has nearly 100% success rate. And that's post-exposure vaccines and rabies immunoglobulin. Now, luckily, we have fantastic guidance in the UK. So given that we don't wait for symptoms, an animal doesn't have to be behaving weirdly at the time of the bite to transmit rabies. And there isn't a single test we can do to check reliably for rabies before symptoms because our body doesn't even know we've got it. So we can't really test it in advance. That's why we don't pre-blood test. And also, given that treatments once symptoms prevent are basically suck, we have to treat this really cautiously when someone's been bitten abroad in a rabies endemic area. So travel health isn't just about pre-exposure, pre-travel consultations. It's about recognising things post-trip as well, like looking at people with fevers who might have dengue or malaria. Same applies to rabies risk as well. So we have great guidance and really recommend you put this on the to-do list to have a read of, whatever field you're in, because this is an NHS service. It can be offered privately as well, but it is a free NHS service too. If you have a look on the list here, you can pick out the number depending on where you are in the world right now that suits you. But all these numbers are in the back of the Green Book chapter on rabies as well. So you don't need to frantically write anything down right now. But we have got all these virologists waiting to help us out. The downside is if you're really good at discussing rabies with people, you'll find that you discover more post-exposure cases because you'll be talking about rabies and someone will go, ooh, I got scratched 5 years ago in Morocco by a cat. And you'll think, okay, now it's a post-exposure consultation, and many times that's how I've established cases in my clinics. So you'll definitely need this info if a patient turns up with a story like that, or if you're now thinking back to that time in Turkey when you befriended a cute kitten, which I'm hoping you've all been sensible with animals, but still. We'll come back to that shortly. So what happens? In this guidance, you've got a risk assessment form, which is really straightforward to complete as long as you've got your patient and you can chat to them and ask them about things. So the first bit of the form is collection of basic information about the exposed person, demographics, that kind of thing. Then you've got to record the details of the exposure incident, like where they were bitten, what animal it was that bit them, and then they get put into a risk category. No, Francis, no cut-off limit for post-exposure vaccine. No, anytime. If a traveller says at any point that they've been bitten abroad in a rabies endemic area by a mammal, you're doing post-exposure. Yeah. So the risk is then categorized. So let's say, well, I'll come back to that in a minute with an example. But basically, there's this categorization going on, which is fairly straightforward. And the virologists that you speak to at Colindale or PHE, sorry, not PHE, UKHSA, they will help sort this out for you. Then they'll want to know the significant past medical history that might affect treatment. So immunosuppression is a big one, of course, because they may not respond very well to pre-exposure vaccines or indeed the post-exposure ones. Previous rabies immunization, which I've put in bold because that's a really important point. Having the vaccines really affects what treatment you get. And then, of course, you say what treatment has already been given. So quite likely what usually happens is people come back from their trip and they've started post-exposure abroad in Thailand maybe, and then they say, oh, you know, Thailand told me to have 2 more doses, so can you give me them? We wouldn't necessarily act on Thailand's advice. We would still always use UK guidance and ring the virologist and say, look, this is what's happened, what do you suggest? And sometimes they do suggest differently to what another country may have suggested, so that's particularly important. And then you get the recommendation from the virologist based on that risk and medical history. They send the vaccines out to you the next day and for free. And then they also send your legal mechanisms for giving medicines, like basically that form acts as a PSD or a written order, and it's signed by the virologist. So you just follow what they tell you. So not much thinking involved, just a lot of information gathering and things. So let's take the kitten bite in Turkey, because it's just really common scenario, really. So you've got a bite, which basically is direct contact with saliva. And then you've got a high-risk country, which if you go on NASNAC and have a look, it's classed as a high-risk country where rabies is present in mammals. So that would, and the animal itself is a mammal, so it's a rabies transmitting animal. So that puts them in the red category. And you don't want to be in the red category, really. That's the most serious exposure. More often than not, deep bites from dogs are the biggest risk of all, but it can be little scratches and things, you know, or just eating a watermelon that a dog has licked, which is one of the examples that one of you in the group has given on the case study form at the beginning. So after that, you then get the recommended treatment, and that generally falls into 5 categories. So no risk and therefore no treatment required. So that would be for like my chap that I saw a while ago who seen a squirrel looking at him in a strange way in the park in England, and had ran up to him and just given him a little nip and then ran off again. And he was terrified of rabies and he came to see me. And so I called UKHSA, and once they'd stopped laughing at me, they said, no risk, but always check these things, always check. Definitely. The other option might be vaccine only afterwards, or you might be recommended vaccine and HRIG, that's human rabies immunoglobulin, which is the blood product, and I'll tell you a bit more about that shortly. Or vaccine, RIG, and a blood test with the last dose of the vaccine to be absolutely sure. That's often used with the immunosuppressed groups to check they've had some kind of decent response to the vaccines. Or it might be observation of the animal for a time period. So the reason it says domestic cats or dogs only is because when an animal gets rabies, they generally will be dead within 2 weeks or 15 days of getting the virus. So they have quite a short incubation versus humans. Humans can harbour it for years, but animals generally die pretty quick. So if someone comes to you and it's day 14 since the bite and it was a family pet and the pet's still alive and well, UKHSA might say, look, see if the dog's still okay tomorrow. And if it is, then we're good. You know, so it might just be that with strays and things, it's impossible to know whether it's been vaccinated or whether it's still alive, especially if you come back from your trip. So you might not know these things. That's why it really focuses on domestic animals. So let's take our person in Turkey who was bitten by a kitten and they're in the red category. This is the difference that pre-exposure vaccines can make. Let's assume they're not immunocompromised, because as you can see in that table, if you're immunocompromised, you get an absolute belt and braces approach and get hit with everything. But let's assume it's an immunocompetent person. So if they were not immunized at all before they went at any point in their life, then they would get human rabies immunoglobulin if available, which is a big question mark, and they'd get 4 doses of the vaccine, the normal vaccine you'd use for pre-exposure. So that would be day 0 being the date of the first vaccine, not the date of the bite, and then day 3, and then day 7, and then day 21. So The rabies immunoglobulin would act like passive immunity. It's infiltrated around the site of the wound and hopefully will clear that virus from the site while your body's trying to produce antibodies to the vaccine. But for that reason, we don't give RIG more if it's more than 7 days from the first dose, just because by that point you'll have some active immunity, which if you know a fair bit about immunology, you'll know active immunity is always way better than passive immunity. So it's just to give you a bit of that fighting chance, really. But the kids in Brighton, Turkey, if they'd had some pre-exposure vaccines, they would be treated with just 2 doses of the normal vaccine on day 0 and day 3, usually up to day 7 there. Well, any time after that, really. So this can make a big difference if you're in the country of origin. So it's much easier to find 2 doses of the normal vaccine than it is to go trekking around looking for a very rare blood product, and much cheaper as well. It can cost about £1,000 a vial for rabies immunoglobulin, and it's really not easy to find. I'll tell you a little bit more about it as it's self. And yes, I should mention pre-exposure, Jane. I've just seen your comments. Yeah. So Hannah, the question there about is the immunosuppressed vaccinated? So that would all be taken into consideration by the duty virologist at the time, like the level of immunosuppression, the type of treatment they might be on, or the medical condition, and that would then be decided by the virologist. Like I say, not much thinking for you at this point, which is quite handy, really. And no, there's not a need to re-immunise after a period of time. Valid for life, Tim. Thanks for the question. Let me talk about pre-exposure vaccine just briefly. So normally in the UK, we class a pre-exposure schedule as someone who's completed 3 doses of the rabies vaccine, usually on day 0, 7 and 21 minimum. Or we've got an accelerated course, which is 0, 3, 7 days, and then a booster at 12 months. That's at the moment what the Green Book guidance is. That's our policy on rabies vaccines that would constitute fully immunised in the UK. However, across the world, a lot of places are using 2-dose schedules now on day 0 and day 7, and there's lots of evidence for effectiveness as 2 doses being a full course. And in fact, in the literature, there's quite a lot of 1-dose suggestions as well. So again, the virologist you speak to would determine whether they class that person as fully immunised or not. They sometimes do count 2 pre-exposure doses as a full course. So it's case-by-case basis. And I think the Green Book will probably change at some point because we've got ViroRab has now got a licence in the UK. And in the SPC for ViroRab, it's licensed for a 2-dose course on day 0 and day 7. So this is going to be interesting. We're in a bit of a state of flux, which is why if you're watching the recording of this right now, do bear in mind the Green Book may have been rewritten at this point. So I've got to be very careful what I say. So, but basically, I suppose the key point is having at least 1 dose is still going to be really beneficial. It's a very effective vaccine. And generally, once you've had that initial course, it's for life. Bat handlers tend to have a lot of boosters and things. High-risk people working with high-risk animals tend to have blood tests and boosters regularly. But for your travellers who are going, the Green Book at the moment recommends that you can consider a dose at a year if you class them as high enough risk. But it's probably not really that necessary. Once you've got rabies antibodies, you've pretty much got them for life. Again, depending on your level of immunosuppression, but it's a very, very, very good vaccine. Yeah, and ID as well on day 0 and 7. Yeah, 2 doses. Yeah, so a lot of clinics have been doing intradermal vaccines, especially while all these shortages have been happening, because it's a really good way to preserve the vaccine, make it cheaper for people as well. It can cost 150 to 200 quid to get vaccinated for rabies, and it's something that puts people off getting it a lot. But often they don't really understand the benefits. Like the financial benefits to having your pre-exposure is much better than trying to find RIG, which is £1,000 a vial usually, and a flight to get it somewhere, not usually available very locally. And I think another key point here is if somebody has had the pre-exposure vaccines, make sure they take them with them on the trip so that they get treated properly. Otherwise, they'll be treated potentially as unimmunised, and then they might need RIG, and then they're going to need extra doses of the vaccines, and it would all be unnecessary. So one of the The rig itself is made from non-UK based humans or animals. So you can get e-rig as well, like equine rig. And it's basically taken from people who are either dying of rabies at the time, so their antibodies are really high, or they've just been vaccinated. So this is why it's in such short supply. It's really hard to get hold of. And of course, it's a blood product, so it carries bloodborne risks. It's scarce. It often involves a flight somewhere. It really does ruin a trip, having to go and find rig somewhere. But then again, so does rabies, so you don't want to risk that. And it does have higher risks than vaccination, really. But it's only given because people have none of their own antibodies at this point. If you've got your own antibodies because you had your vaccines, then great, don't need rig. So it's very good. You don't generally give rig if it's been more than a year after the exposure as well. That's another thing. But you still give the vaccines if it's been more than a year, definitely. Monoclonal antibodies are being looked at too. Some countries are using monoclonal antibodies in place of rig, which is a lot cheaper, like 20 quid a vial versus £1,000. But we need to sort of just watch the space on that. But rigs do count monoclonal antibodies as and they emit rig if somebody had a monoclonal antibody as well. The key point here, though, is that vaccination beforehand simplifies the treatment, makes it less risky, less hassle at the destination, cheaper, and a much better chance of success after a bite as well. Close to 100% if it's done properly. So people say things like this. They come in, they go, doesn't it just buy you more time having pre-exposure vaccines? Or they say, I'm in a city, there's plenty of medical care, I'll be fine. But that's not a guarantee that you'll be able to find this product, the rig. And often people come back and they've not been given rig. They might have had their vaccine started, but there was no rig available. And it's there is a bit of a time association in that you need to go and get help really quick, especially if you've got no antibodies. But it doesn't mean that you can wait another 24 hours or something if you've had the vaccines. It's about basically racing this virus to the brain and getting there before it gets to the brain. So that's why the second part of that statement is a bit of an issue as well. 5-star resorts are big places for people getting exposed to animals, and the illusion of safety and security. Same with short trips. Most bites tend to be reported within 3 weeks of being in a country. So it's not even about like that risk there. Anyway, so this is meant to be about helping you to have conversations with travellers. So I'm going to run through some cases now and just talk about some of the common things that people might come up with as to why they trivialise or decline rabies vaccines or dismiss them, really. And health professionals do this too, I've noticed sometimes. So let's take a look at some of the things that travellers will say to you. So this is very closely linked to the last point that I'll just get treated out there if anything happens, or I know all the nearby hospitals. So this is a very common VRF statement. People visiting friends and relatives abroad, they often do this with malaria too. Like, oh, I'll just get treated if I get there. I know the doctors, it's cheaper out there, that kind of thing. So we'll look at a case now from Nigeria. Of a local person who was exposed. So January the 1st, 2017, 40-year-old farmer was bitten on the hand by a stray dog. The dog was chased and killed by members of the community. The victim sought medical assistance in the local clinic straight away. All good so far. In the clinic, he was given tetanus and an antibiotic, but he wasn't given rabies post-exposure prophylaxis, which is vaccines or rig or both, because it just wasn't available. The nearest big hospital was over 100 kilometres away. So he sought a traditional treatment instead, which was for dog bite and rabies. That involved eating the cooked liver of the killed stray dog and placing the hairs pulled from the dog on the bite wounds, like rubbing them into the bite, which in itself is a rabies exposure. Dogs lick their skin, saliva can be on hair and that kind of thing. So that in itself is total opposite of what you would do, really. On March the 1st, he exhibited severe headache, paresthesia, severe pain at the site of the bite. This is a very common symptom, actually, really bad pain at the site of the bite. He was treated with diclofenac and an antibiotic, and he was rushed to the hospital there to be tested. When he got there, he had signs of fever, he had nausea, paresthesia of the right hand, headache, difficulty swallowing, hydrophobia, all the classic symptoms of rabies. He collected his saliva and it was positive for rabies. And I'm sure you can guess what happened next. He sadly died the next day. And this is just one of those cautionary tales about relying on traditional treatments sometimes, or not bothering to go somewhere because it's really far away. Yeah, not good. Now, this case I took from this journal article that's linked at the bottom there, and there was another case written in this journal as well in 2019. So, cute picture alert coming up. So, common question or statement people make, isn't it just stray dogs that spread rabies? Not going out and about much. Or sometimes people say it's only a short trip. Or, yeah, we've got a puppy. I mean, what harm can puppies do? And pets can carry rabies too, of course. They get bitten by other animals. Like you get lots of notifications of raccoons biting animals and things like that. Vaccinations are routinely given to animals in endemic countries, which does make strays a little bit more likely that they might not have been vaccinated, but there are mass vaccine campaigns. Switzerland were very creative. Switzerland had a problem with rabies in foxes. So they laced... Quick interlude, because my internet started going funny at this point in the live webinar. So just adding this little patch in to account for when I started to sound like I was rapping and then disappeared. So just to say, I think it went at the point when I was talking about chicken heads raining from the sky, which was a method that they used in Switzerland to try and eradicate rabies in foxes. And they laced these chicken heads with live attenuated rabies vaccine, scattered them across the forest. The foxes ate them and became immunized. That's basically what I was saying or about to say if we are watching the edited version of this, of course. And then we went on to the next case. The only thing to say about the next case, which we'll cut back into the live webinar very shortly, but the bit that probably wasn't on the original live, because I was gone and talking to my screen, not realizing I'd even gone anywhere, and we're talking about the case, which you'll see on the next screen. And generally, if an animal is behaving oddly and you can't rule out rabies, then generally the recommended treatment is euthanizing them. And in the particular case that's coming up, the owner didn't want to euthanize their puppy because people don't like euthanizing their puppies, basically. And I think that was the only add-in. But the next bit of the webinar you're about to see is from the live version, just after I'd come back from somewhere in cyberspace. Sorry for the interruption, and I hope that just fills you in a little bit. Ooh, why is it the day you do a Zoom course, your internet decides to mess up? Phew, we're back. Right, catch up. So this puppy has had abnormal behaviour. Everybody's been recommended vaccines. The owner said no because it was too costly. The dog actually died of rabies, and she still didn't accept the post-exposure prophylaxis because of money, basically. Thank you for the reassuring messages in the chat box, and I'm so sorry again. Don't worry, this will be recorded, and luckily you can catch up by quickly reading the case there. Anyway, you can probably guess what's going to happen here. On May the 16th, 5 weeks after the bite, the owner presented with signs of fever, paresthesia on the right hand, difficulty swallowing, hypersalivation, photophobia, dyspnea, and hydrophobia, all the classic symptoms, and we all know what's coming. She died on the second day of hospitalisation. Really, really sad case. Indeed, just because someone couldn't afford it. And this is the thing, people decline pre-exposure vaccines or even post-exposure vaccines because of the cost. Yet, you know, and this is what happens, unfortunately. So also the other key point, no matter how cute and fluffy something is, it can still kill you there. So another case here of people often misunderstand this, and and if somebody's already asked me this at the beginning of the course, so I hope this answers that question. There's people going, it's been so long since the bite, it's too late to do anything now, right? I'm in the clear, you know. Jennifer, it can be years. Just to answer your question, 93% of all rabies cases happen within the first year when the symptoms appear, and on average 2 weeks to 3 months, but it can be years. The longest I've seen in the literature is 25 years from bite to symptoms. So yeah, it could be. This is why we treat it really cautiously. Uh, just another cautionary tale from the literature, really. Over in Australia, there was a case of rabies with a very long period here of incubation. And I'll just summarize it for you. So, 1990, a 10-year-old girl of Vietnamese origin developed rabies. She'd lived in Australia for 5 years, which was considered rabies-free at that point. When she died of rabies, and then they took her brain and they did all the usual tests and things, and they managed to sequence the genes, which seemed to be sourced in Asia, specifically Vietnam, which the girl had left in 1984, which suggested an incubation of 6.5 years. It's quite a long time. So you can harbour it for a very long time. And Jennifer, your question came at a very good point there. We are on the same wavelength. Here's another case just to tell you about, again, very sad case. You may have heard about it in the news. When you tell people to stay away from animals, particularly kids, I mean, my kids don't do anything I say. So far better advice is to give pet advice, really, than tell people to stay away from dogs. Very hard for most of us to resist, actually. The amount of adults I speak to who can't resist a cute, fluffy animal as well. But you may have seen this case of this girl in the Philippines who had been told from birth, just don't mess with dogs. And in countries where rabies is endemic, it's drummed into people about rabies and playing with dogs and things. So this is a particularly sad case because this girl was too afraid to tell her parents. So again, just taken from the literature, 9th of February this year, a 13-year-old girl in the Philippines was bitten by a stray dog while walking home from school. She didn't tell her parents because she was afraid that they would disappoint her. That she would disappoint them, sorry. Instead, she said she scratched herself on some metal wire. No medical attention was sought because of it. And then the 5th of April, she developed serious symptoms. She got all the classic stuff, fever, back pain, fatigue, difficulty drinking water. And it's so sad this because she was Googling all these symptoms and she knew it was rabies from the beginning. She then finally told her mother what had happened. She was rushed to hospital. A quote from the mother there, she felt her heart being crushed when she saw her daughter's condition deteriorate. She had to be restrained. She was in a lot of pain. Absolutely horrible case. Brings a tear to the eye. It really does. Sadly, on the 6th of April, she died of confirmed rabies encephalitis. So we have to be really careful how we explain this to parents because you don't want to risk the child being too scared to tell you if they've done something wrong. Pet advice is much better. Like saying, if a dog bites you, you must come and tell me straight away. Don't be afraid to tell me. Because what all of these cases so far have in common is that none of them would have been expecting their encounters. All of their families will now be championing rabies vaccines. All of them could have survived if they just had access to the right care or had enough money or done things quicker. What a great shame, when all these deaths could have been intercepted by vaccination. You also get the classic, isn't it just dogs? I don't like dogs. I mean, any warm-blooded mammal can spread rabies. Carnivores, particularly a high risk because, of course, they tend to be a little more bitey. But herbivores as well, like cattle, horses, deer, they can also harbour rabies virus. Somebody's put an example in the cases of a pig bite on the neck. Which got treated with post-exposure treatment there. Rabies-infected rodents and primates have been sporadically described, tend to be slightly lower risk than other animals, but still you should always treat with caution there, really. Watch out for monkey forest in Bali. A lot of people get monkey exposures there because the monkeys are really tame and they go and feed them and stuff. And there's no rig on the island at all, so they really struggle to get treatment. But importantly, you can tell people to avoid animals, but you can't tell the animals to avoid you. I've been chased by many a pack of dogs while I've been away. I'm sure all of you have stories about that too. You just need to be running or cycling, and then dogs seem to love to chase. I got chased by one this morning on my bike on the way to school, actually. Nearly came off. So it's not to be underestimated, really. It's not just dogs. I'm just looking at Sue's question. What's the percentage of hoofed animals that pass rabies? Well, we don't know theoretically because we intercept rabies with post-exposure treatment so much. We don't necessarily know the exact risk, but there is a risk. They can carry it, and that way, and we always treat cautiously based on that. This is an article of a a rabid hyena that was on the loose and killed 3 people. And injured 16 others. Like, we can't necessarily say that animals are going to avoid us. And Sue, just to help answer your question, you're on my wavelength as well, because then my next slide is about the chances of getting rabies. So you may have heard of Robert Stephan, who is a very prolific writer in the field of travel health, and he's got his famous Stephanogram. And what he tries to do is categorize the risk based on unvaccinated people getting diseases for vaccine preventable things. And then he categorizes why the risks are. And usually, rabies is generally right at the bottom, low down. Hep A and typhoid are generally a lot higher up. However, look at animal bites. Sorry, not bat bites. Animal bites are right up there with the risk of flu and usually COVID as well at the minute as well. So really, perhaps our attention should be on the risk of exposure rather than the risk of disease, because we don't really know. Like most things in travel health, a lot of what we do is preventative. We never really know if we saved someone's life. And a lot of what we do is a just in case scenario. So a better thing to focus on is how likely are you to get bitten? And that's why we categorize the risk when we look at people's trips and we go, well, you're there for a long time, or you're there working with animals directly, or in a lab with the rabies virus, or you're cycling or running, or you're spending a lot of time outdoors. Like, all of these things can increase the risk of transmission. And that's why NASNAC categorizes the higher risk travelers like that. But it doesn't mean that we're not at risk if we're not doing those high risk things. So that's why we should always still be talking about rabies. There was at the NECDM conference, I see some familiar names who were also at the NECDM conference a couple of years ago. There was a really good talk. Sorry, a couple of weeks. Did I say years then? I'm trying to read the chat box comments, and I should really stop doing it because it's distracting me. I'm terrible. I can see that people are answering the questions. Thank you so much for doing that. And I'm going to try and avert my eyes because it distracts me. So yeah, a couple of weeks ago, we went to Copenhagen to NECDM. It was fabulous. If you can get yourself to one of those conferences, it's really good fun. So interesting. I took a picture on one of the conferences like you do, you're trying to remember everything people are telling you. And this guy was presenting the Stephanogram, and a very bold statement within Robert Stephan's literature there. Rabies PrEP now deserves #1 position above Hep A and typhoid. That's the argument. And I can totally see why, because more people are treated for animal bites than they are for rabies, itself, but we don't wait for symptoms. So it might be fairly rare in UK travellers and indeed in certain animals, but bites and scratches certainly are not. And are we good at intercepting it? Some statistics for you. So 25 human deaths been recorded between 1902 and 2005, which doesn't look that much really. All of them were from but one were from a dog bite, a lot of them from the Indian subcontinent. But in 2019 to 2020, there was 3,400 calls relating to prophylaxis or post-exposure treatment. 12% of those were exposed to bats, 88% to animals overseas. Each year, 2,000 people in the UK require treatment for UK HSA, and 15 million people receive treatment worldwide. And some of those will be our UK travellers. So we wanted to really focus on like how to address questions and things like that, and how can you actually give and don't worry, this is the last slide. I'm just conscious of the time. Sorry, we had that little glitch before that's knocked me back a little bit. But how do we talk about this when we've got so many things to discuss? We've got a 20-minute slot. How do you reiterate all these things I'm telling you, in just a short period of time? Well, take-home messages is going to be the key, summarizing, chunking the information and giving the key points. So firstly, telling people that if rabies is in that area, which it probably will be, it's under some travellers on NASDAQ in most places, telling them rabies is horrible and deadly. It's a fatal disease that can kill you in a horrible way. So perhaps giving some of those statistics, like I've told you during the course, right? Just mentioning things like there's 60,000 deaths a year. Half of those are children. People, like 2,000 people in the UK get treated for post-exposure animal bites in the UK every year. And so on. Then, of course, the transmission, so that it's spread through the saliva of infected mammals. The animal doesn't have to look rabid, and it doesn't have to be a dog. And that's a very key point as well, that it's saliva. how to deal with it. So you must clean any animal inflicted wounds out, really, even small ones, really well. Wash it out, even with dirty water. Deal with the other infections later, but use alcohol, antiseptic, and head straight for medical treatment straight away, particularly if unvaccinated as well. Then, of course, you have conversations about the vaccine. So rather than being tempted to answer that question of do I need it, do I not, we don't know if they need it. They only need it if they come across an animal bite. So a better conversation is to say, look, if you have the vaccine, say it will affect your post-exposure treatment if you need it and your survival chances. If you do have it, bring your vaccine records with you and make sure that you've got them. It's like an insurance policy. And then, of course, the considerations for them specifically. So vaccine hesitancy, addressing that, well, if you don't like vaccines, you'd have an awful lot more abroad if you didn't have your pre-exposure vaccines, plus you'd have a blood product. I'm sure the guy who was bitten on his penis by a dog who was unvaccinated, I bet he was regretting not having his pre-exposure rabies vaccines because rig is infiltrated into the site of the wound. Not a particularly pleasant case there. Money decisions could be something that they're considering. And again, it's a really good investment, generally always protects them for life once they've had that initial course. It's cheaper than buying flights to go and get rig, which is not always available. And the insurance doesn't always cover it either because it's not a medical emergency. It's not confirmed rabies, it's prophylactic treatment. So insurance companies can be a little funny about paying for flights and stuff as well. Or they may just be unable to picture a scenario. So put it in context for them. Say, right, tell me, what would you do now if you got bitten by a dog while you're eating outside in your restaurant and a dog comes and just nips you on the ankle? Picture the situation, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. Tell me what you would do. That checks understanding as well. We should always check our travellers have understood the advice we've given them. And interestingly, there was a study in emergency medicine that showed that 80% of health information is forgotten immediately, and that 50% of information we give to people is recalled incorrectly. And a lot of people don't understand the information and don't even realize they don't understand. So testing that understanding and then giving them something to take away, links to maybe the Travel Health Pro fact sheets, which are brilliant because you can just click share, put their email address in, and then it sent emails to them. It's dead simple. All of that can take 30 seconds out of what I know is people's busy days, but it's well worth it. It really is. Don't worry, this is my last slide. If you want to read all about my experience as a post-exposure rabies case and some of the key points from this webinar, the link there is on the slide. Could my job have saved my life? Probably did. And my experience as a post-exposure rabies case. So do have a look at that for the summary of the key points from today. Also have a look at some of the courses. There's face-to-face courses for the extroverts amongst you, and there's e-learning for the introverts who don't want any human contact during the course. The link is there. And also we'd be really grateful for some feedback. There should be a link in your inbox now, I believe. We've got more webinars coming, and Michelle, I've totally forgotten what the next topic is. I'm so sorry, you told me to mention it, but I've totally forgot. Put it in the chat box if you won't mind. But we're looking for ideas. We'll put on more free sessions if you want. I hope it was useful. Good luck if you're going on holiday this summer. Hope I haven't put you off your trip too much, but don't go and make friends with any cute, fluffy things. That's my main take-home message. Don't get bitten. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry about the glitch in the middle. I'm so sorry. And I'll see some of you again sometime, I hope. Oh, thanks for the nice comments. Oh, thank you. Next session, 2nd of August, flu. Be there. I don't think that one's me, that one, but it will be someone else. I'm sure they'll be fabulous. Have a lovely Friday, lovely weekend, and I hope none of you are booking post-exposure treatments right now. I haven't really been able to follow the questions here. I've got 1 minute left, but do you think those of you who've been on the course, have they been answered? I notice people answering things for me. Terrifying. I've never had that as feedback for a course before. Terrifying. Boosters. Oh, boosters. Yeah. So yeah, the Green Book at the moment recommends a booster dose a year after primary course if continued high risk. It's something you can make on a clinical judgment basis, really. Generally speaking, a booster isn't going to be necessary most of the time. But of course, consider if your traveller's immunosuppressed and they need a helping hand with their immune system. And I'd go on a case-by-case basis. But even if they haven't had a booster for 20 years, it will still affect their treatment in that they don't need RIG. So it's still beneficial even 25 years ago with no booster. I hope that briefly answers your question. Oh, availability of vaccines, Lucy. So Vero Rab now will hopefully, I mean, we've been using it unlicensed for years in the UK, but now it's got a license. We may see a bit of an increase in availability, hopefully. And of course, we may see a change to the pre-exposure schedules as well. So keep an eye on the green book for rabies for sure. Vero Rab is Sanofi, Hannah. Yeah, and they've been making it in France for a long time. It's very good vaccine, very good indeed. And in the SPC, Lucy, they've got an option for a 2-dose schedule. Yeah, 0 and 7, but it's not in the green book yet, so it's not policy yet. At the moment, our UK policy is 3 doses pre-exposure. Until we're told otherwise, basically. And we've got Rabipure, of course, which Valneva have been struggling to keep up with the demand because our beloved rabies BP, the bright pink vaccine, disappeared in 2022. So, yeah, I love that. Bright pink, really, really good for ID as well. No, very low risk with the vaccination, Catherine. It's an inactivated vaccine. It's not live. Much safer than getting rabies or taking your chances. The rapid course in the SPC is 0-7, which is interesting because our UK guidance is 0-3-7 plus 12-month booster. So who knows what will happen there? Your guess is as good as mine with regards to JCVI. I know I'm going to get nagged in a minute to end the session because it's 1:32. I'm trying to answer the questions as quick as I can, but I hope that was useful. I'll look at the chat afterwards, and when we put the recording up, if there's anything I've not addressed, I'll reiterate it on the recording for you. Okay, I'll do my best. Yeah. Yes, share the recording far and wide. Yes, it's great promotion for Health Academy as well. So we'll be more than happy for you to share the link and that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, my voice has just about lasted after a week of having a cold and being worried if I could actually talk my way through this. Done it. Oh, thank you so much, everybody. Feel free to log off, go and enjoy your afternoon. Hope you're not in clinic, but if you are, I hope you don't get any post-exposure rabies because they always come on a Friday afternoon, just as you're about to leave. Just so you know, I'm sure there's a study in that somewhere, but that does happen, unfortunately. Happened to me many a time. God, UK HSA might be quite busy now with some calls. I don't even know how many people were on this session. How many were on, Michelle? I have no idea. Let me stop sharing that now. Please share the link as I missed some due to terrible Wi-Fi. You can just find it on the Health Academy website. So just Google Health Academy online, go to the free resources area, scroll down, you get to the lunchtime webinars, sign up for all the other ones there as well. And you'll also see loads of free resources and a blog. Do have a good delve in. Oh, Michelle's put it in the chat box as well. So great. Follow Michelle's link there and you'll be able to come to us for various training and things. Oh, thanks, Leslie. And sorry, I got really thrown by that Zoom thing. I'm so sorry. I hope I remember to tell you everything. Oh, some lovely comments in the chat box. Thank you so much. Hello again. To you, this will seem like a second has passed, but to me, several hours have passed since we finished the webinar on rabies, which I thank you very much for attending. There was lots of questions in the chat box, and I kind of lost track a bit with the chat box. So after the session, I downloaded the transcript of the chat box, and I went through everything and had a look at your questions just to make sure that things were crystal clear for you. So I'm going to address as many questions as I can now. Here they all are. So Why is it so hard to get the vaccine at present? Well, quite a bit of a history to this. At the moment we have just had this one manufacturer, Valneva, making the fabulous Rabies vaccine and being the only suppliers in the UK with a UK licence. And so that's been pretty tough on Valneva, I imagine. On top of that, a lot of vaccine companies went into COVID vaccine production in the last few years and turned their attention away a little bit from the more traditional vaccines, so that could have had something to do with it. There's always problems at manufacturing stages, at every single stage of making a vaccine, where it could go wrong, and who knows, there's probably lots of issues I'm not even aware of, but it has been very difficult. We have now got ViroRab, of course, which I talked about on the webinar, which is nice. We've now got another UK licensed vaccine. Yay! I still miss Rabies BP, the bright pink vaccine we used to have that went out of use in 2022. So we will hopefully be a bit more in supply now ViroRab is around a bit more. Of course, we've been using that for years in private clinics. I may have mentioned that on the webinar actually already. And we've just been using it off license, so it will certainly save a bit of time in consultations trying to explain what off license means to patients as well. Every little helps, as Tesco says. So yeah, that's why. Just to reassure you though, if you're ever after post-exposure treatment, there's always supply for that reason, and that's another reason to call UKHSA. They'll send them to you for free. They don't have any issues with supply because they keep a stockpile, so you're good to go when it comes to post-exposure. Next question. Well, there's quite a lot of questions about boosters, actually. This person's asking, is it beneficial for a booster if some years have passed since the primary course? Well, firstly, boosters are always beneficial for anything, really. It's always a good idea to prompt your immune system to remember its job when it comes to certain diseases. With the rabies vaccine, though, very, very effective vaccine in the immunocompetent population. So you'll pretty much always have antibodies once you've had an initial course, providing your immune system is okay. The Green Book at the moment recommends you could consider boosters for certain people in high-risk groups after a year after the primary course. But it's largely down to clinical judgment, really, and an assessment of the risk and also the traveller's budget and their intentions and everything. It certainly won't harm them to have a booster at all. It won't. But their primary course will still be their primary course. So if they didn't have a booster and they still had evidence of a primary course and they could show that at the other end to somebody if they needed post-exposure treatment, then that should be enough. Even if the course was 15, 20 years ago, they've still got those antibodies, which is great. Is there a cut-off limit for post-exposure vaccine, or can it be given at any length of time? I think this question is probably answered as we went through the webinar. I reckon this was asked a bit earlier on, but no, there is no cut-off at all for treatment. It could have been 80 years ago that somebody had a bite and you would still start post-exposure treatment. I was trying to understand this question when I read it. No, it wasn't this one. It was another one. So this person says, I thought pre-exposure was 3 vaccines, 0, 7 and 21 or 28 days. I've seen some clinics are doing a week's course. And I think, again, we touched on this in the webinar, but there is a 0, 3, 7 course, which has a booster at 12 months. That is a reason to give a booster in the current UK schedule anyway. And yeah, so if you haven't got time, if the traveller's leaving before they can finish a 21-day course, then yeah, absolutely, they can go on that accelerated course. As discussed though, ViroRab has a licence for a 2-dose accelerated course, which is 0-7. So watch this space for the rabies Green Book chapter being updated when JCVI have considered the evidence. There's plenty of evidence out there for 2-dose pre-exposure, and a lot of countries do use it, originally starting because of budgetary issues and things like that, and poor resources and that kind of thing. But now we've got lots more evidence from those countries doing that actually it's very successful. And in fact, the literature's even indicating that 1 dose might be effective as well, and has been quite effective in some of the trials. So watch this space, I guess. Here's another question. There's been recent confusion with timings. Please clarify. I've always said if no pre-exposure, go to medical care ASAP, first few hours straight away. But if had 3 vaccines, go within 24 hours for 2 vaccines. If it was me, I tend to leave hours out of it. I'd just be very focused on get to help as soon as you possibly can. Just keep the advice really, really simple for travellers. Go and get advice quickly, because remember that traveller may think, oh well, I'll wait a bit. I've had my vaccines, so I'll just go and have a few drinks first and catch up with a friend or something like that. Or they might think, oh, I'll wait till I get home, but they want to go straight away, because there's no guarantee that when they get to the clinic, wherever they're going, that clinic will have the treatment that they need, and then they may be sent somewhere else, and then somewhere else, and before you know it, 3 days have passed and they've still not found a clinic. So just straight away is my advice. Is there a need to re-immunise after a period of time, or is immunisation valid for life? Yeah, provided you haven't had a full stem cell transplant and wiped out your immune system completely, then no, that's absolutely fine. Your primary course is your primary course. It's a great investment. This one says, a patient said, oh, this is more of a statement than a question. A patient said a travel insurance would not cover post-exposure treatment if she had not had pre-exposure vaccines when there was a risk. And yes, I've heard quite a lot of this going on as well. So travel insurance is interesting. They often won't fork out for things like flights and rig for people who have been clearly at risk and ignored medical advice. And NASNAC actually puts on the website that anybody going for more than a month should definitely be recommended rabies vaccines. And in a large part, this is for insurance purposes. A lot of insurance companies will say the same, like if you're going for a month or more, then you have to have your vaccines, or we're not paying for your post-exposure treatment. So I've heard of a few travellers coming very unstuck that way. I've even heard of insurance companies turning down people who've gone for like a week away somewhere and not having the vaccines. They'll do what they can to get out of having to pay £1,000 for rig and flights somewhere. So I'd say the rabies vaccines themselves are an insurance policy. Look at it that way. And I learned something new actually today, and so thank you very much for sharing this. When we were talking about the hairs being rubbed into the wound of the chap who was bitten, I didn't realise that's where the phrase "hair of the dog" comes from, with a hangover, and the full sentence being "the hair of the dog that bit me." Makes perfect sense, doesn't it, that came from there? Interesting. Every day is a school day. And this person here says, so even after 10 years exposure, the schedule of PEP is day 0, 3, 7, 21. So yeah, yes, it depends on what context you're asking this question, actually. I'm not sure where we were up to on the course when this question came through. But if you were bitten 10 years ago and you didn't have any vaccines at all pre-exposure, your post-exposure would be this schedule pretty much, yeah, or something similar. Yeah. If you had had your vaccines, like say 12 years ago, and then got bitten 10 years ago, then it would just be 2 doses of the normal vaccine. And yeah, no rig after a year since the bite as well, generally speaking. This person is asking, are there any cases of rabies with exposure to animal saliva but not bitten? And yes, there are absolutely cases where we've had mucous membrane exposures. I tell you what, a lot of people like to kiss dogs on the mouth, I've noticed. Quite common. Or be licked on the face by dogs. I actually, embarrassing to admit, but I was licked on the eyeball by a rabid dog who I'd got very close to. All in the blog, read the blog. But the next bit of this additional information from the webinar is going to be me going through the cases that people have presented, and some of those are very interesting. Some of those are saliva exposures, that people that haven't been bitten but they've had an exposure to saliva. So again, a lick over a wound is a classic one as well. I think there's one of those in the cases, so I will get to that and you'll see some examples. Thanks for all the questions, everybody. I hope that's addressed what you were wondering about, and yeah, we'll have a look at cases next. So at the beginning of the session, I very briefly flashed up a survey just to see if I could get some of the gossip from your clinics as to what post-exposure cases you might have dealt with and how. I was particularly interested in how the travellers got the exposure, really, because it's interesting to hear about all the different cases that you get in clinics and the reasons why people say they've had an encounter with an animal. And you haven't let me down. There has been some fabulous responses illustrating some very interesting points. So I'm just going to run through some of those first. I'm going to obviously make sure these are as confidential as possible. It's double blind. I don't know who's given me these, and so I can't say where in the UK this happened. And so yeah, it will hopefully be maintain confidentiality. Right, so cases. I'm just going to read out some of them. So there was a man in Bali. He was having lunch before flying home, dropped his serviette under the table, got scratched by a cat when picking it up, and then there was a mad panic when he got home to find the vaccine at the weekend. I think I ended the session by saying it's always the weekend when people show up, when you struggle to get hold of people. Another one here. So this again addresses the previous question about saliva contact. So somebody ate some watermelon from a bowl that a dog had also eaten out of. The dog had died of rabies. That was the one and only time they gave rig in that particular clinic, and they were wondering where it would go because it was a mucous membrane exposure. So they ended up giving the whole amount of rig into the leg, which would be the standard protocol actually for a mucous membrane exposure. And another one, actually, another mucous membrane, a backpacker who was licked in the mouth by a dog, then decided it would be funny to straight away kiss their friend as a joke. The friend also needed post-exposure treatment. Oh dear. Kissing can be very dangerous, very dangerous. There's the one here, I think I mentioned this during the course actually because I saw it pop up, but an elderly man who decided to tell the clinic that he was bitten by a dog 40 years ago in India. He hadn't had any treatment, so they very sensibly set him off on a course of post-exposure, which he was quite surprised about, according to this case. Somebody else mentioned a monkey bite in India. Someone else has mentioned someone being licked by a cat in East Asia on a cut in their hand, so they ended up with post-exposure treatment. Someone's put, I've never been bitten or anything, but I did take a kitten to my room in Turkey when I was 18, but now I'm much more sensible. Glad to hear it. A lot of people have actually said general stuff. This person has said lots of travellers having consultations and then realising they had been exposed a few years ago, so having to initiate post-exposure treatment just as PHE Colindale was about to close for the night. That's someone who's been doing it for a while, if they're still calling it PHE. I still call it PHE as well. Most memorable was a colleague providing treatment for a young gentleman whilst travelling in Southeast Asia, took care of a sick bat and gave it a drink by dipping his toothbrush in the water and then putting it in the bat's mouth, and then got drunk and brushed his teeth with the same toothbrush that night. Post-exposure for him. Another mucous membrane one, and another man. All of these have been men so far. It's funny actually, in the literature, men do come up a lot as being higher risk. Your guess is as good as mine there. Another one, there was a time that the person who wrote this was in Morocco and a cat decided to jump on the person's lap at a restaurant, and because this person is so scared of rabies from talking about it all the time, they jumped up, the cat flew across the room, hopefully didn't come back for revenge, but everyone in the restaurant was looking at them. Oh dear. And the same person actually has also recalled a time when they got the camera case stolen from a monkey in Bali. I bet that was Monkey Forest there. What else have we got here? Oh, this is a really interesting one because a big thing in travel health at the moment, I mentioned sometimes on the updates, is selfie deaths. So people who died taking selfies, like walking backwards off a cliff or into traffic, it's a thing. It's a thing now. Everyone documents their trip, don't they, and puts it on TikTok and stuff. Anyway, this is a case of somebody who was taking a selfie with a pig, and he had a burger at the time. The pig was trying to eat the burger, but inadvertently bit the person's neck, which is quite a severe exposure because it's near to the brain, of course. And this person sounds like they were on holiday at the time, rather than in a professional role at the time. So she or he nagged them to go and get their post-exposure rabies vaccine. It seems that they were laughed at for suggesting this, but eventually the person did go and get post-exposure treatment and was given vaccinations for it. So pigs, who knew? Somebody else has put too many to list, but they're always unplanned and unexpected, and they've put that in capital letters. Yeah, I would agree with that. Someone else has put monkey biting barley at monkey sanctuary whilst feeding them, as instructed by the tour guide. Was told by the tour people not to worry and just wash and cover it. Thankfully, the hotel manager, 2 days later, asked how they injured their hand and immediately called for the hotel doctor because the patient was flying home that evening. Post-exposure started in Bali, and that person turned up in the clinic the next day. As the GP practice had said, we don't give rabies vaccines. You read in my blog my experience of being in the NHS and people not necessarily realising that this is an NHS treatment. So that kind of also supplements that message there. Patient in Goa went to the beach every day. Same dog slept under the sunbed with them, both respecting each other's space. On the second to last day, patient stood up off the sunbed and the dog bit his ankle. Only sought treatment once back in the UK, which was 5 days after the bite, and had called the GP for a tetanus vaccine and have not had any pre-travel advice at all either. Same story there. We don't give rabies vaccines. You'll need to go private. Oh dear, what a shame. I hope this webinar reaches far and wide so that people do realise that this is something that can be done through the GP surgeries for sure. And you don't necessarily have to be travel health trained either. You can initiate this with the PSD and an understanding about why you're giving the drugs, which hopefully you understand from watching the webinar. So yeah, what a shame. Another one, young adult in India, family home was petting and feeding a young dog through the neighbour's fence and the dog bit her finger. They were aware of the rabies risk because the family dog had been vaccinated against rabies, but the neighbours' dogs weren't vaccinated. The patient chose to fly home, and after a little help from the GP nurse, that person came to see this person at 1 PM on a Friday of a bank holiday weekend. There's a bit of a theme happening here, isn't there? Which was a 40-minute drive from her home. This person followed the post-exposure pathway. She needed RIG as well. This nurse had to then use her weekend to go and administer RIG by the looks of it. Oh no, the GP was long gone, asked the practice nurse to administer, had to be infiltrated around the affected finger. This very kind nurse drove back to the clinic to see her, all very stressful. Indeed. Oh, well done to that person sorting that out. And then finally, I think there's one more case I've printed out here. Yeah, so cabin crew in Thailand had an extended stay due to fly back in a week via Bangkok. Took her rubbish sacks out to the bins and a street dog went for one of the bags which she lifted out of the way and it ended up biting her calf. She decided to not seek advice. She decided without seeking advice to wait until she returned to Bangkok. Had the first dose in Bangkok the day of the flight, and after the usual conversation with the GP practice, was told to come to this person's clinic. Again, she required RIG after following the post-bite protocols. Started straight away. Well, some good cases there. Thank you. I think hearing a case about how these things happen. I mean, the general themes here are that these are not expected occurrences, really, that things happen abroad without knowing. And when a traveller says to you, do I need my rabies vaccines? It's very hard to say yes or no, isn't it? They might not need them. They might not get bitten. But they'd be very glad if they did have those post-exposure vaccines, wouldn't they? I hope that's been useful for you. And sorry, it's meant the webinar is now a little bit longer than it was originally, but I hope that answers your questions. Thank you to all of you who joined on the day, and I'll see you soon.